Gonzaga Socratic Club was founded over a decade ago, so we've been doing this for a little over 10 years, meeting once a month during the academic year, and we take our inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by C.S. Lewis in the mid-1900s, and they took as their motto to follow the argument wherever it leads. They were especially interested in, C.S. Lewis wrote an article about the Socratic Club and said that each individual interest group had its own club in Oxford at the time, but there wasn't a group that was designed to get people with wildly different views into one place, and that's really what the Socratic Club was all about, especially with respect to Christianity. But lest you think they just brought the theists in, it was famous for having presentations not only by theists like C.S. Lewis himself, but critics and atheists as well. So we try to follow that. We have a range of speakers and topics. Our speaker today is from Gonzaga's Religious Studies Department. It's Dr. Matt Rindge. And I'm very pleased to see scholarship on film. I know we often think that movies are fun to watch, and they are. But films provide a way, I think, to read and understand and respond to or critique the culture that we live in. And so Dr. Rindge has just had published, if you see the book table over here, a book called Profane Parables by Baylor University Press, and it's fresh off the press. It still has that new book smell, I'm sure. And so this is
it does.
love for Dr. Rindge, and he can't present the whole book. I've started reading it, and it's striking, lots of good ideas. You can pick up a copy afterwards if you'd like to. But he's going to give us a taste of some of the topics in the book. So let's welcome Dr. Matt Rindge.
Thank you, David. I'm very thankful to. Is the mic working okay? Okay. So I'm very thankful to Dr. Calhoun for inviting me to speak here. This is my second time presenting at the Socratic Club, and the first time that I presented was just a few years ago. I talked about lament and talked about Fight Club a bit, and so there's some thread of continuity to that.
But you were only part of a panel, so you didn't have as much time as we have.
That's right. And yes, so the topic might be super sexy, but the speaker is not, and therein may lie part of the problem for not drawing more people. So that's what you need to work on for future Socratic events, I think. So I want to start by reading a quote by the film director and producer George Miller, who directed Mad Max Fury Road, which was nominated for a slew of Oscars this year, and won 5 or 6, most of them in the technical area. Most of them were won by women, one of those being his wife. George Miller must get some diversity award because in addition to directing Mad Max Fury Road and the original Mad Max, he also directed Babe, about the little pig, and Happy Feet, about the penguin. So his interests span a spectrum. And George Miller said this, quote, "I believe cinema is now the most powerful secular religion, and people gather in cinemas to experience things collectively the way they once did in church. The cinema storytellers have become our new priests. They're doing a lot of the work of our religious institutions, which have so concretized the metaphors in their stories, taken so much of the poetry, mystery, and mysticism out of religious belief that people look for other places to question their spirituality." Now, Miller here is not saying anything radically new. He's drawing on a fairly lengthy tradition that sees an interface between film and religion. So in 1951, the French film critic André Bazin opened his essay, Cinema and Theology, with the sentence, "The cinema has always been interested in God." In that essay, he argues that film was, quote, specifically religious, or better still, specifically theological. He called it a phenomenology of salvation and grace. And in fact, from its infancy, we could go 30 years back before André Bazin to a 1921 essay by Jean Epstein, another French film critic, who described film as profane revelation. And that's partly where I got part of the title for the book from. Now, one of the most common religious categories that has been applied to film has been that of parable. Yeah. So many people have been able to see some parallels between the stories Jesus tells and morals that might be conveyed in those stories, and perhaps similar kinds of morals that are conveyed in film. But the prevailing understanding of parable tends to be somewhat bland, myopic, antiseptic. Because Jesus' parables, rather than upholding morals, tended to devastate them. They tended to subvert, bless you, they tended to subvert conventional morals or myths. So rather than inculcating certain values that were cherished or conventional myths, Jesus' parables tend to undermine them. So Jesus' parables tend to provoke rather than comfort, and to disturb rather than to provide solace. Does anyone recognize this painter? No?
Van Gogh.
Yeah, Vincent van Gogh. And does anyone recognize what he's painting here? A man. We're putting a man on a horse, I think. Yes?
Is it the Good Samaritan?
Yeah, the Good Samaritan, which is a horrible title, because it implies that there might be only one of them who's actually good, right? Yeah. Yeah. And he's never called good in the parable. But this is one of Jesus' most well-known parables. It only appears in one gospel, in Luke's gospel, Luke chapter 10, 30 to 36. And we could talk about Van Gogh, but we're here to talk about films. So the parable itself occurs within a broader dialogue between Jesus and the lawyer. And biblical authors tended to be very careful about structure, much more careful than we are today. And one of the structural things that's going on in this dialogue is that the lawyer will ask questions, and Jesus will never give an answer to the question. Whenever Jesus is asked a question by the lawyer, he always replies with a question of his own. And so there's a pseudo kind of Socratic device that's being employed by Jesus, in which he's inviting the lawyer to construct the answer for himself. That seems to be more important to Jesus than simply giving him an answer. And Jesus does give answers to the lawyer, but only in response to answers that the lawyer himself gives. There's a lot we could talk about this. Tim has heard me talk about this for an hour or so. But one of the provocative messages of this parable is that by virtue of helping the beaten man on the side of the road, the Samaritan is doing something that's absolutely essential for eternal life. Because the lawyer says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus asks him about how he reads and interprets the law. And then the lawyer is going to cite Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then they get into a conversation about who is my neighbor. And the Samaritan ends up loving the person in need. Essential, again, for eternal life, according to both Jesus and the lawyer. And the Samaritan is also, at the very end of the story, the person that Jesus invites the lawyer to become like. So the Samaritan is not there as an object of pity, and Jesus doesn't challenge the lawyer to love the Samaritan. He challenges the lawyer to something much more difficult, which is to become like the Samaritan. Now, why this is difficult is because at the time, Samaritans are religious and ethnic outcasts. They're ethnic outcasts because in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquers the northern kingdom of Israel, and its inhabitants are dispersed, and they end up intermarrying. Jews from the northern kingdom of Israel intermarrying with foreigners, and their descendants become the Samaritans. So they're only part Jewish. They're mudbloods, to use J.K. Rowling's terminology. And they're also religiously problematic for several reasons. They only consider the first 5 books of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, to be sacred canonical text, so the Torah or the Pentateuch. They had their own version of the Pentateuch. We know this because it's been discovered. It's called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Samaritans went through and they edited the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. They worshiped God in their own temple at a place called Mount Gerizim, an explicit violation of Deuteronomy 12, but it just so happened that in the Samaritan Pentateuch, Deuteronomy 12 didn't say that you had to only worship God in one place, so it was conveniently left out. And there was violence between Jews and Samaritans. So in 129, 128 BCE, a group of Jews led by John Hyrcanus destroys the temple at Mount Gerizim. So the character who's eligible for eternal life by virtue of loving the neighbor, and who is charged, the lawyer is charged to become like, to imitate, to emulate, is a religious, ethnic outcast with whom many Jews have a violent relationship. And so it's hard to get us thinking about the provocative edge because we're so distant from that culture, but if we think about what the parallel of a Samaritan would be for most Christians in America today, a member of an Islamic terrorist group like Al-Qaeda fits the bill really well, because you're dealing with a person who is not definitely, but likely ethnically different, religiously similar, but also different, and a member of a group with whom we're engaged with violence. And it's difficult to imagine many Christians in America hearing that such a person could get eternal life and that such a person in any way could be our model for behavior or a person that we should imitate. I think it's easier for us to imagine that kind of difficulty. So the Samaritan parable is typical in being provocative, in being disturbing. This is from a Haitian artist who captures a lot of the elements that Van Gogh gets in his painting. In the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, this is the last parable Jesus tells in Matthew's gospel, the final judgment is envisioned as something that will be solely determined whether someone goes to heaven or hell, not by a person's faith or belief, personal morality, sexual morality, not by one's religious identity or ethnic identity as a Jew or as a Christian, not by religious participation, but simply by one thing. Have you fed the hungry, given water to the thirsty, clothed the naked, invited the foreigner into your house, cared for the sick, and visited those in prison? And if you do those things, one goes to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell. And that parable disturbs many Jewish and Christian ideas about what the judgment might be based on. An even more disturbing parable is another parable unique to Luke, in Luke 16, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where going to heaven and hell there is not even determined by whether one helps the poor, but simply by whether one is rich or poor. So the rich man dies and he goes to Hades. The poor man, Lazarus, dies, he goes to heaven. And the only explanation Abraham gives for why one character goes to each place is that the rich man in his life received good things, and therefore now he's in agony. And the poor Lazarus received evil things in his life, and now he's comforted. So again, parables tend to disorient us. We could talk about religious texts as texts of orientation, disorientation, reorientation, and parables tend to disorient. They tend to take the floor on which we think we stand so securely and rip it out from under us. John Dominic Crossan, who's a former Irish monk, he's still Irish, but he's not a monk anymore, who spoke at Gonzaga a few years ago. He taught New Testament at DePaul for a couple decades. He uses this spectrum of different types of narratives, which I think is very helpful in regards to how different narratives interact with a myth. So if we think of a myth as a story that provides meaning, whether it happens to be true or false, but a story that's a source of meaning. An apologue is a story that defends the myth. So John Ford's Westerns, The Searchers, for example, Stagecoach, are apologues in that they defend the myth that European settlers in America were peaceful people who were set upon by these savage indigenous Native Americans, and that European settlers had to use violence almost as a last resort to defend their women and children against these horrifically violent people. Action is something that tends to be neutral. Satire and parable attack the myth. They skewer the myth. You're familiar with satire with Stephen Colbert, yes? Yeah. Maybe not currently, but his most recent iteration as this made-up character. Satire is a genre that goes back over 2,000 years. We have ancient examples, yes, Aristophanes. We have examples like Erasmus and Jonathan Swift. You know, we need to eat the little children, and that will take care of poverty among the kids. And parable, what? A modest proposal, yeah. And parable just completely annihilates the myth. So have any of you seen Top Gun? Yeah, 1986. It's a classic apologue in defending certain American myths. Yeah.
Who directed that?
Mr. Scott. Sorry. I apologize.
This presentation brought to you by
So the trailer is a little dated. Yeah, Bruckheimer's been around for a long time. I think the Scott who directed this was the one who committed suicide. Yeah. Tony's brother.
No, Ridley is the...
Yeah, Tony, right. Tony was the one who committed suicide just a few years ago.
Right.
Yeah. So according to Tom Cruise, he does a movie after Top Gun with Paul Newman. It was a sequel to Paul Newman, Jackie Gleason film about pool sharks, yeah, Color of Money. and he has a conversation with Paul Newman, where Paul Newman asks Tom Cruise, what do you think about the messages that your films send culturally? Cruise says, I don't know, what do you mean? And Newman says, well, you might want to think about that. Yeah. And Cruise says this affects him pretty significantly. And so 3 years later, he does a radically different film called Born on the 4th of July, where he plays the real-life Ron Kovic, who went to Vietnam, wanted to be in the Marines since he was a young kid, but is injured in Vietnam, becomes a paraplegic, returns home, eventually becomes a chief opponent of the war, leading veterans who were opposed to the war. And in many ways, this film and this scene functions more like a parable vis-a-vis certain American myths, in contrast to Top Gun. He's come back from the war, he's living with his parents, he's come back from a long night of drinking.
What's going on? Are you drunk again? Hey, Mom. He's drunk again. Eli, leave the drunk for your son. Leave that. Do you leave that alone? Give that. You can't stay in this house.
Isn't it, Mom? It's just what you believe in, but I don't. I don't believe in him anymore. Because he only has 3 days up there. Me, I gotta spend the rest of my life. I wish I were dead like him.
You don't know what you're saying.
That's the problem, Mom. I'm not dead. I gotta live. I gotta live and I gotta roll around. I gotta ride for Vietnam. And you don't want to know. You want to see us. You want to hide us. You want to hide us because it is a can of shit. And I am a fucking dummy.
He won't listen. He won't change.
Ron, please. You gotta take your mom seriously. You can't drink in this house. They told us. Go fight! Go kill! Serve your man! Rape hard! Now it's all that! All that! All that! That's all I want.
Fine, stop it. Go to bed. You sleep it off. What did they do to you in that war? What happened to you? You need help, Ronnie. You need help.
You need help! All your God and your bullshit dreams about me! You aren't ashamed of me! You're embarrassed by me! Listen to me, let me talk to him, all right?
You go to bed. Every single
Fuck you!
What did you say to me? What did you say to me? What? Ah!
Fuck you! Ron, man, that's enough!
Take him up.
Tell them! You guys, Carolina! Walters! You tell them all what they did to me! What they did to this whole block, this whole country!
You're gonna call the police
This
this
is
time.
Vietnam style communism. We show women and children.
You shoot women and children? What do you say?
Listen to war, communism, the insidious evil they told us to do.
That's what they told us.
Thou shalt not kill women and children. Thou shalt not kill, remember? Isn't that what you taught us? Isn't that what you taught us?
Stop it! Stop it! I don't want you in this house. You're out of this house.
Ron, come on now. You make...
Okay, so unlike Top Gun, there are a lot of myths that get upended there. American myths of morality and the myth of the noble warrior hero, and the myth that we can simultaneously be a nation that is Christian, that somehow abides by the Ten Commandments, and yet also send people away to violate one of those commands, and to do so without severe psychic or spiritual harm to that person. So this was only one of 2 films for which Tom Cruise has been nominated for an Oscar for. I'm not sure what's happened to his conversation with Paul Newman, because he doesn't seem to have continued, the trajectory.
Jerry Maguire, when he was it Jerry Maguire?
Yeah, yeah. So we have different kinds of parables. We have some visual parables by an artist. Does anyone know what artist this is?
Banksy.
Banksy, yeah. An anonymous, secretive, underground British artist. Initially did a lot of work in London. Now has been around the world. He's been to Gaza a few times. He was in New York City about a year and a half, 2 years ago for a month. There were two things that I couldn't get permission for to get in the book. And one of them were these images by Banksy. One reason is because you can't contact the guy. And so his PR person that I contacted said, no, there's no way you can use anything. So, but Banksy is fabulous because he takes the myth, in this case, the principal symbol of British honor, pride, glory, and says, what is that rooted in? And it's rooted in child slavery. Literally, there's a child making these in China or Indonesia, And historically, what is the British Empire founded on? This is a slightly disturbing image. The girl in the middle was famous from a photograph that was taken during the Vietnam War. A girl who was running after a napalm attack that was committed by the United States. And one of the things Banksy likes to do, like in the previous photo, is juxtapose things that we tend not to think of as intersecting. So he's asking people to think about the role of American corporations in certain atrocities around the world. And this is one of my favorites. One year, Banksy sent this out as his Christmas card. And he's suggesting, that the real reason Jesus died for us is so that we could go to Macy's and Nordstrom's. That's the primary benefit of Jesus' death on the cross. So I became interested in three films: Fight Club, American Beauty, and About Schmidt. Fight Club and American Beauty appeared in 1999. About Schmidt came out about 3.5 years later. And these films they indict the American dream. The American dream is their principal object of critique. The main character in each of these films is a white male. In Fight Club, he's a 30-year-old single man. In American Beauty, he's a 42-year-old married man with one child. And in About Schmidt, he's a 60-plus-year-old retiree. And so one of the things I liked about these films was that they offered multiple generational perceptions into the failure of the American dream to provide psychically and spiritually what people yearn and long for. In 1967, Robert Bellah, a sociologist, wrote an article on American civil religion, where he argued that in addition to Christianity and Judaism, there is also a national faith in the United States of America that largely goes unnoticed, that has received not much attention, and he calls this American civil religion. And one of the reasons why American civil religion is able to thrive is because most Jews and Christians don't see it as idolatrous. In fact, they see it as completely compatible with their faith, so that to be a good American and to be a good Christian are almost one and the same. I was intrigued by taking several elements that are ingredients in many, not all religions, and seeing that they can fairly easily map onto America, so that we can talk about America having a sacred text, symbol, rituals, hymns, days, origins, values. This was the second thing that I tried to get permission for to use in my book, but I wasn't allowed to. The painter is a gentleman named John McNaughton, and this is called One Nation Under God. He painted it in 2009. What's great on John McNaughton's website is that if you hover the cursor over each character, you get a little description. And what's fabulous about this is that it's kind of a quintessential illustration of American civil religion. in which Jesus is presented as a kind of founding father and as a kind of either advocate or possibly author of our sacred text, the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. The people on this side are kind of the good guys, quote unquote, and the people on this side are the bad guys, quote unquote. This becomes really obvious because one of the characters is Satan up there. I don't know if you can see him clearly in the hood. But this is a Supreme Court justice, an academic professor holding Darwin's Origin of Species, a guy from Hollywood, etc. One of the signs that these elements are sacred is the ease with which they can be desacralized. And there is often fervent protection in order to keep these things from being from keeping their sacredness from being violated. I don't know if many of you recall the Coca-Cola advertisement in the Super Bowl 2 or 3 years ago, where America the Beautiful was sung in multiple languages, English, Spanish, Arabic, Mandarin. There was an outcry in response to that, and threats to boycott Coca-Cola because how dare you have this song sung in anything other than English. And there seem to be certain ways in which ethnicity gets brought into purity and impurity kind of concerns over a number of these kinds of things. Erich Fromm, who is a neo-Freudian, neo-Marxist psychologist, he said that a man was more likely to be lynched if he went out into public on a street corner and burned his flag than if he were to go out on that street corner and say, I don't believe in God. Because there's more sacrality attached to that flag than there is to God. So the American dream has had a lengthy critique. It's been critiqued quite a bit by African Americans, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Langston Hughes, for only applying to certain people who have white skin in America. And a number of psychologists like Freud, Erich Fromm, Carl Jung, Viktor Frankl, the latter of whom tend to be existentialist psychologists, have focused on both religion and psychology in an existential way as being concerned about meaning, finding meaning in life. This kind of resonates with the Protestant theologian Paul Tillich's definition of religion as ultimate concern, that thing about which one gives one's psychic energies, that thing from which one derives meaning. And a lot of these psychologists argued that the American dream was not only damaging for non-white people in America, but also for whites and even for wealthy whites. And then we have a lot of artists who critique the American dream. One of my favorites is F. Scott Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby, which was initially going to be called Under the Ash Heaps of Millionaires. Then it changed to The Great Gatsby, and 3 weeks before the publication, Fitzgerald telegraphed his publisher. We can't do that anymore, can we? Telegraph? That's an ancient form of communication. It's kind of like texting. And he said he wanted to change the title of The Great Gatsby to Under the Red, White, and Blue because he wanted his criticism to be a little bit more apparent. But his publisher said, no, it's only 3 weeks to the date. We don't have enough time. The last few paragraphs of The Great Gatsby I consider to have some of the most poignant lines about the American dream that are metaphors for the American dream. Fitzgerald writes, and as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we'll run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So for Fitzgerald, the American dream that we chase and pursue, if it ever existed, it existed only in the past, and so it's impossible to get there. Yeah. And even in the past, it was illusory. Okay, how much time do we have left?
I've been watching the clock, so another 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So these three films that appear, they appear at an economic zenith in the United States if one measures such things by, say, the S&P 500, Standard & Poor's 500, which are the 500 largest companies in the United States. 1999 had the highest 5-year annualized returns, 10-year, 15-year, 20 years, since 1970. It was an apex. Things didn't go so well right after that. Yeah. And then we had another dip in 2008. But these films that critique the American dream appear at a time when things are going well, economically, for certain people in society. How many of you have seen Fight Club? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, how many of you have seen American Beauty? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many of you have seen About Schmidt? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So, whoa. So this is one of our introductions to the main character in Fight Club, who's an unnamed narrator, played by Edward Norton.
It's very sarcastic.
Yes.
Like so many others, I had become a slave to the IKEA nesting instinct. Yes, I'd like to order the Eric Kari dust ruffles. If I saw something clever, like a little coffee table in the shape of a yin-yang, I had to have it. The Klipsk personal office unit, the Hubatrek home exerbike, or the Ohaneshot sofa with the stringy green stripe pattern, even the Rizlanko wire lamps of environmentally friendly unbleached paper. I'd flip through catalogs and wonder, what kind of dining set defines me as a person? I had it all, even the glass dishes with tiny bubbles and imperfections, proof that they were crafted by the honest, simple, hard-working indigenous peoples of wherever. I was holding. We used to read pornography. Now it's the Horchak collection. No.
Okay, so the main characters in Fight Club, American Beauty, and About Schmidt are all recipients of what the American dream has to offer. They all have a stable job, secure income, steady paycheck, nice place to live. American Beauty and in About Schmidt, they have families. But each of these main characters is profoundly dissatisfied, psychically, spiritually, with their lives. And you start to get a bit of this here. A couple things that are kind of subtle but important. When you looked in his refrigerator, you saw that he has only what? Condiments, yeah. And so there's a lack of substance to his life that's symbolized visually in that way. His condo is going to explode and blow up. And one of the things he's most worried about when that happens is that all of his neighbors are going to find out that all he had in his refrigerator were condiments, that he didn't have any food at all. He also mentioned that we used to read pornography, and that was the Horchow collection. Yeah? And so the narrator is also presented at the outset of the film as being completely alienated relationally. And part of his growth over the course of the film that's coupled with his rejection of principal tenets of the American dream is to try to be able to move closer in relationship to another human being. So if one imagines that pornography is a step away from an actual living, breathing human being to a manufactured image, yeah, he has moved on from that to something that has left any vestige of humanity behind. Yeah, he's only concerned with stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Now, in Fight Club, American Beauty, and About Schmidt, the critique of consumerism is overt. It's obvious. Both the narrator and the main character in American Beauty, Lester Burnham, played by Kevin Spacey, are going to end up quitting their jobs and descending on the economic social ladder. And in that descent, they find meaning. Yeah. So there's a fairly clear critique of the American dream as being spiritually bankrupt. What was intriguing to me, and what was a bit of a surprise to me, was that both of these films also offer a profoundly countercultural message about death. So in 1973, Ernest Becker, social psychologist, got the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death, in which he argued that the fear of death, the denial of death, is the principal neurosis that affects people in Western civilization, and that we develop all kinds of additional neuroses to guard ourselves against death. Becker says that death is the secret terror that haunts us all the time. It's always present, and it influences all our other fears. That was in 73. The following year, a book is published by Philip Aurier called Changing Western Attitudes Toward Death. And Aurier corroborates Becker's thesis. He argues that there's a fundamental revolution toward death that happens in Western culture. And he says it originates in the United States of America around 1900 and accelerates markedly between 1930 and 1950. He argues this based on changing practices around the death of the body. So the location of the death shifts from the home, where people in the family see their family member die, to the hospital, yeah, where doctors now preside at what Arias calls an absence of a ritual ceremony about death. The mandatory wearing of black at funerals disappears. The practice of going up to the casket, and it's called a casket, Arias says. It used to be called a coffin, but that was too morbid. So it's a casket. The practice of going up, looking at the dead person in the casket, the coffin, embracing the relative. Arias says we've moved on from this. He says embalming, which begins in the early 1900s in the United States, in California, which was a practice that was unknown in Europe, is because we're wanting to somehow think that this person has not died. And cremation is a more extreme means of that. So one of the things that surprised me that I wasn't expecting was that in Fight Club and American Beauty, to some degree in About Schmidt, there's a countercultural message that the more one tries to keep death at bay, the more unwilling one is to confront their own mortality, to face their own death, the more spiritually dead a person will be. And so the antidote to spiritual death in these films is not merely rejecting certain core tenets of the American dream in terms of what is a source of happiness or meaning, but also a willingness to face, encounter, and embrace one's death. So if you've seen Fight Club, you know that the main character's initial step towards growth happens when he joins a support group for men who have testicular cancer. And he sees people mourning the losses in their lives associated with this cancer. And he says after going to these support groups, every night I died and every night I was resurrected. So explicit religious language will be used to describe his journey. after the support groups, he begins the fight clubs, for which the movie is named, at which men fight each other. And the point of the fighting is for one to receive physical pain. It's not to hurt or harm another. And so the first homework assignment that Brad Pitt's character, Tyler Durden, will give members of Fight Club is to go out and start a fight with a stranger and to lose that fight. Because we're militating against a culture that celebrates success. And so the gospel of Fight Club, as it were, is to embrace loss, embrace failure. Near the end of the movie, one of the last acts that the main narrator takes is to shoot himself to try to get rid of this Tyler Durden persona. And so he's going to get as close to death as he possibly can. Tyler seems to disappear, which he doesn't in the novel of Fight Club, which is why there was a Fight Club Part 2 that appeared last year, written by Chuck Palahniuk, the author of the novel, in a graphic novel form. Fight Club, when it appeared, it was instantly polarizing. Critics either loved or hated it. Rex Reed, critic for the New York Observer, was the most extreme. He said that Fight Club does not have one single redeeming quality, and it will have to find its audience in hell. And then there's American Beauty. And like the like the unnamed narrator of Fight Club, the main character, Lester Burnham, plays someone who, at the outset of the film, despite receiving what the American dream has to offer, is spiritually, psychically dead. He, in fact, in his opening monologue, he says, "Within a year, I'll be dead, but in a way, I'm dead already." He says, "I feel like I've been in a coma for 20 years. And one of the things that's going to awake Lester out of his spiritual kind of death is Angela, a high school student, a friend of his own daughter, yeah, which is one of the reasons why, like Fight Club, this film was controversial. Some feminist critics have argued that American Beauty celebrates pedophilia, and it defends the pedophile. And yet the tagline of the film, "Look Closer," invites us to kind of peer behind some of the veneers. They put that sign up into Lester Burnham's office space, "Look Closer." Those vertical bars on the computer are significant because in the first 4 scenes, this character is going to be portrayed as being like in a prison. So we're going to see him in his shower, where he's masturbating in the morning. He says it's the highlight of his day. We're going to see him slouched in the back of the van. We're going to see him looking at his wife in the garden behind a plate of glass. And before we get this shot, we see his face reflected in the computer. Those bars were initially horizontal in the screenplay, and then Sam Mendes, the director, had them changed to vertical because he wanted it to look more like prison bars. Annette Bening she was nominated for an Oscar for this role. American Beauty won 5 Oscars at the 2000 Oscar ceremony. Annette Bening is enamored with success. In fact, she says that one has to project an image of success at all times. And in this way, I think she is articulating something that lies at the heart of the American gospel of elevating and worshiping success, where we have very little room, very little in the means of healthy coping mechanisms for failure in the American culture, and the epitome of failure is death. And we don't know what to do with death. Roses are going to be associated with Carolyn almost in almost every scene. She's trying to sell a house. She's committed to selling the house. It doesn't go well, so she breaks down crying because she can't cope with her failure. And this is a man that she kind of worships, Buddy Kane, because he incarnates success financially, professionally. And then we get Angela, and we're going to get roses associated with Angela also. And this is going to be the first kind of lustful fantasy that Lester Burnham has of Angela Hayes. And a lot of these roses figure prominently. And this is significant in that these roses were the only things that the filmmakers used CGI for in the film. And so there's a way in which the method or the means is the meaning. Because the roses with Carolyn and with Angela are going to highlight the illusionary, the facade. Because Lester lusts after Angela because he thinks she's this highly powered sexual young woman, very experienced sexually. At the end of the movie, he has an opportunity to have sex with her, and Angela tells him that she's a virgin. And for one of the first times in the film, Lester makes a choice for someone else and not only for himself. And he opts not to have sex with her. There's a lot of interplay between American Beauty and Lolita, Vladimir Nabokov's novel. They both feature a 42-year-old man who's the main character who falls in lust with a much younger girl. And in Nabokov's case, Humbert is going to consummate that relationship sexually with Lolita, with Dolores Hayes. Hayes is the same last name as Angela Hayes. And if you take Lester Burnham and you rearrange those letters, you form the anagram Humbert Learns. So there's something that Alan Ball, the screenwriter of American Beauty, was trying to say about something that Humbert could have learned that he didn't, that Lester does, which is that even though Angela awakens him spiritually, she's ultimately not the answer that he's looking for. Part of the answer that he's looking for comes in the form of Ricky Fitz, the next-door neighbor, who always is videotaping. And Ricky Fitz is a drug dealer, high school student. He starts to date Lester's daughter. And Ricky Fitz is interested in things that are contrary to what our American culture elevates. Ricky's going to say that this is the most beautiful scene that he's ever filmed. A little plastic bag that's floating, dancing in the wind. That made him think that there must be a benevolent force in the universe that doesn't want Ricky to be afraid. And Ricky has reason to be afraid because he gets beaten physically by his former military Marine father, Colonel Fitz. So in this scene, Ricky is filming a dead bird that's on the ground. He talks about filming a dead homeless woman, and near the end of the movie, he's going to look at the dead body of Lester Burnham after Lester is shot and killed. And Ricky talks about how in death he experiences God and beauty. And so I still don't know what to make of this proposal that is, Fight Club says that the closer you get to death, the more meaningful your life becomes. That I get. And the more distant you are from death, the more meaningless your life is. That I understand. American Beauty offers both an existential and an aesthetic argument. And there's an aesthetic argument about meaning in death, but also beauty and God residing in death, in the corpse. Yeah. So I'm still trying to figure that out, but it's clearly antithetical to American sensibilities that want to say that the beautiful is Angela, the cheerleader, the red rose, even if those things are artificial or veneers. At the end of the film, after Lester dies, he speaks directly to the audience in a kind of breaking of the fourth wall, where he talks about his experience post-death and what that can mean for us as viewers. Yeah. The screenwriter of American Beauty, Alan Ball, went on to create a television show called 6 Feet Under. It ran on HBO for 5 years, from 2001 to 2006. It focuses on a family that owns and operates a funeral home in their house. Every single episode begins with somebody dying. Alan Ball says he set the TV show in Los Angeles because he considers Los Angeles the world capital of the denial of death. Alan Ball had a childhood experience which profoundly kind of shaped his attitude toward death. Alan Ball says, "When I was 13 years old, my sister Mary Ann was driving me to my piano lesson when she pulled out from a blind intersection into the path of an oncoming car. It slammed into her side of our 1973 Ford Pinto, breaking her neck and killing her instantly. It was his sister's 22nd birthday." Alan Ball says that event, quote, "cleanly sliced my life in two. Everything before the accident, everything after." He was interviewed in 2007. And in that interview, an interviewer says to Alan Ball, "You repeatedly explore the intersection of pain and beauty in your work. How much does that come from your own experience of grief?" And Alan Ball says, "All of it." And the interviewer asks, "All of it?" And Alan Ball says, "I mean, when I was 13, I was in a car accident with my sister. I saw her die in front of me. I got her blood all over me. And that changed me. It changed everything." And then the interviewer says, "How?" And he says, "I don't think I would have been a writer even. I just think that experience fucked me up beyond belief. It also made me a deeper person than I ever would have been. I'm going to start speaking in cross-stitch homilies now. It opened my eyes to how truly important life is and how truly important it is to see it in all of its complexity and not pretend it's just the nice parts. If you pretend it's just the nice parts, you're not really honoring life." So, there's an invitation that's offered in Fight Club, in American Beauty, in About Schmidt, to face and perhaps even mourn our own deaths. And in that facing and encountering of our deaths and our mortality and our ultimate failure, to be able to find meaning. Yeah. Death is, for these three films, in some ways, the requisite door that one must pass through before one actually dies, if one wants to be spiritually, religiously alive.
How does that happen with About Schmidt?
Yeah, so About Schmidt, I think it happens in a couple ways. The dramatic ways when his wife dies from a brain clot, an aneurysm. When he's just talked to her, he goes to the store to do some errands, he comes back and she's dead on the floor in the midst of vacuuming. And that completely changes their whole plan of retiring together, traveling around in this RV together. And it's somewhat of a catalyst for him to begin to think about his own future death. Yeah? And in light of his own future death, what kind of meaning will his life have had? And in his words, his life will have no meaning at all because he hasn't made the world better for anybody else.
Except at the end when he receives the letter from the child in Africa or something.
Yes, yeah, in Dugu, yeah, from Tanzania. Right, which I think surprises him and awakens him to a profound influence he's had on someone else's life that I think he vastly underestimated. Are we good on time?
Yeah. Do you want to open for questions?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Questions?
Yes.
Comments?
And share your name too.
Sure, Luke. Quick question about Ricky and the camera, because I've seen American Beauty a billion times, and I've always thought about that. And is that a subtle validation of film and filming?
Yeah.
As a means to capture beauty?
Yes. And that was my initial thought. Because Ricky Fitz's camera is the primary way that he kind of engages the world around him. He sees through the camera, and the filmmakers do a very sophisticated thing, which is that we see the world through his eyes and through his camera, and they'll change when he's videoing. The filter that they'll use goes to a grainy, kind of dirtier filter look. But he captures things of beauty on his camera. The plastic bag, the dead homeless woman, the dead bird. And so I think that film is suggesting that film itself is in fact a primary vehicle of divine beauty. But he also captures on that camera child abuse, physical abuse of Jane when her mom slaps her in the face, and also the abuse when his dad beats him up, and it gets captured on the video. So I think they're wanting to say that film is or a primary vehicle of transmitting both beauty and ugliness.
Isn't it also possible too that it seems to me the film conveys the idea that he lives almost vicariously through his filming, and even the relationship that he tentatively establishes with the daughter, Jane,
yeah.
Right? It's like he doesn't know how to have a normal relationship, and so the film at the same time seems suggesting that film captures beauty and ugliness, and also it can be a kind of buffer that we can use to keep ourselves from really being connected with them.
Right, yeah. And when you get to understand the family context from which he emerges, his relational difficulties become more understandable, right? But yeah, I think most of the characters, except for the gay couple in the movie, almost all the other characters are very relationally fractured. And Ricky, you see it with him having to use this barrier.
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Keep them coming.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like some of the magic of the parables, at least in Scripture, is the ability of the person receiving them, hearing them, to use their imagination. Could you maybe give a comment as to how can film maybe enliven the imagination, or potentially how can it limit the imagination as a medium?
Right. That's a really good question.
TV will rot your brain.
Yeah. It's a complicated question. I think one of the devices or techniques or strategies that Jesus' parables, especially the ones in Luke, use, are to invite the audience to identify with a certain character and see the story through the eyes of that character. And then what Jesus often does is he ends the parable prematurely before that main character has a crucial choice to make. So the parable of the prodigal son, which is another bad title, of the younger son who, uses his dad's money and dissolute living, whatever that means, and comes home, and the older son's not very happy. Yeah? And he's at the field. And so the father goes to the older son, and he tries to get him to join the party. We had to celebrate. Your brother was lost, now we found him dead, he's alive. And the elder son was just upset. You never even gave me a little goat, celebrate. And then the parable ends. And so we never find out what the elder son does. Now, Jesus tells that story in the context of Luke 15:1 and 2, where he's dining with tax collectors and sinners. And Pharisees and scribes show up, and they get angry that Jesus is dining, welcoming, eating, and drinking with tax collectors and sinners. So he says, oh, there was a father who had 2 sons. And so the characters in that story map onto the people in that scenario. So that the elder son is like the Pharisees and scribes, the younger son is like the tax collectors and sinners, Jesus is like the father in the story. So that if the Pharisees identify with the elder son, and then he ends the story before he has to make a decision, that decision then gets transferred to the Pharisees and scribes who are standing there. So it's an invitation for them to sit down at this meal with people that they may not be too crazy about. That happens a lot in Luke's gospel, 4 or 5 times. So that's a certain imagination of that requires character identification, and then to wonder at the end, what would I do in this person's place? What should I do? So that people end up writing the script of the parables, finishing the script with their own lives. Now, there are a few films that I think have done this. One is a movie called Dogville by Lars von Trier, a Danish filmmaker. And like all of his movies, it's a rather difficult film to watch. This one maybe more so because it's 3 hours and it's very minimal props. So it's like you're watching a play. But at the end of that film, I think he's trying to get viewers, especially those of us in America, to indict and condemn ourselves. I do think there are a lot of ways in which I think film might stultify imagination, right? You will appreciate this, David. In my film class, students want to see 2 Terrence Malick films, Tree of Life and To the Wonder. And 85% of the students hate those films. They can't stand them. They think it's absolute torture that I'm inflicting upon them because they're so slow. And where's the plot? Where's the action? Where's even some dialogue? I mean, because we've been so oriented and primed to engage with film in a very certain way that in almost any film that detracts from that typical model, people can have a very difficult time. I mean, one of the difficulties with American Beauty is that there is no character that most people say, oh yeah, I'm just like him or her. Yes, I'm going to cheer for that person. No, because all of the characters are, we want to kind of distance ourselves from them. And so I think there's a certain kind of, with Terrence Malick's films, especially his more later ones, I think more than imagination, it's more of a kind of like attentiveness, a stillness, a meditative, contemplative attitude he's trying to instill in people that most viewers find very difficult. But he's clearly an exception. I don't know if that helps or...
No, yeah, for sure. Have you seen his latest yet?
No, because Night of Cups hasn't opened in Spokane yet. It will be 2013 before it comes here. It opened in 2015. It opened over a year ago at a film festival. And then opened in LA and New York about a month and a half, 2 months ago. So
it's in very narrow release right now.
Yeah.
So.
And I want to say it's interesting because part of it stylistically looks very different than stuff he's done before, and then part of it also looks very similar.
About parables, I was thinking about this idea of parable as subverting, and I'm not a Bible scholar, but it seems to me some parables subvert, but other parables intensify. An example maybe would be the house on the rock, the house on the sand, ground your life. So he's not so much. I mean, you can map that onto Psalm 1, for example, right? The wise man is like the tree planted by the watercourse who focuses on the law, right? So what he's doing there, it seems, is I like exactly what you just said, that the parable tends to end with an invitation. In that respect, parables seem almost existential, right? That there's an invitation, who will you be? What will you do? But a parable like that, or I don't know, maybe the parable of the sower is more instructive than subvertive. I'm just curious. I mean, I'm sure you know the parables better than I do. Would it be true that while many are subversive in the way that the parable of the Samaritan is subvertive because it undermines all kinds of assumptions that Jesus' audience has about who Samaritans are and what a neighbor is. But some of them are more instructive or intensifying. I'm curious, what do you think of that?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. I think it's, the parable of the two builders, it does the same thing that I mentioned with the imagination, because it comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7. And so Jesus finishes this very lengthy sermon, and then he says, now there was a wise man and a foolish man, and the wise man heard my words, and the foolish man heard my words. And so instantly, if you're in the audience, there's a potential ability to see yourself in those people because you just heard Jesus' words. And then he says, well, the wise man acted on them, the foolish man didn't. Yeah, I think in that case, there's not a lot of subversion going on. I think sometimes we miss the subversion because we aren't clued into certain contexts.
Right.
So I don't think this is always the case. But the parable of the leaven or the yeast, which is the shortest parable Jesus tells, where he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who took yeast, hid it in flour, mixed it in until it was all leavened. What does that mean? And we can guess at what it means, but every time that leaven or yeast is used in the Bible, it's negative. It's always a symbol of corruption. Always. Hebrew Bible, New Testament. And so Jesus is saying something about the kingdom of heaven being impure. And so that kind of thing we often miss. I think like the parable of the sower, I think that tends to be what some would call maybe a parable more of orientation or confirmation, or you said instructive, but
And I was thinking of the literal meaning of to build in, that he's building something into the hearers, that this is again, I would put it in existential terms, that this is a set of alternatives, and where do you find yourself, or how do you see yourself responding? Because like the parable of the builders, it seems to me the parable of the sower is what are you going to do with the message of the kingdom of heaven?
right. And in that way, they are in some sense empowering in terms of the invitation for viewers to act in response. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Vitriol, yeah. Okay.
Vitriol. I was thinking the films in some ways. The term "the American Dream" seems, thinking back with films from the 1930s and onward, create an American dream in a mass way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure on the history, may not have been there so deeply before.
Huh.
And the dream is a reaction to crises, Civil War, the dislocations of the Depression, the anxieties of the Cold War, and so on. And the individualism that is praised against social responsibility, tradition, a sense of belonging to a continuity of community. So if I'm, and I apologize for arriving late,
Yeah.
but it just seems to me that dream is itself, it's an odd phrase, the American dream. It's automatically suspect if you're basing your life on a dream.
Yeah.
It's not, so these are rambling thoughts, but it seems to me I would orient the idea of the American dream, the image of it, in a crisis, a conflict, several conflicts over race, over the Union itself in the Civil War, and the dislocations of capitalism in the Depression, that mainly the unit, the society was always somewhat new and weakly based. Now, that's just throwing something.
Sure, yeah.
I might be quite wrong.
Well, the term, as far as we know, at first is used in 1931 in a book by James Truslow Adams. And when he describes the American dream, he talks about it as a life that's one that for all people should be better and richer and fuller. So it has this sense of optimism about success.
Yeah.
I do think that, and films are interesting, because I think there are certain films like Frank Capra's films that can be, I think, be understood as simultaneously not only supporting, but in some sense building an idea of what the American dream is or could be, and also resisting certain elements of it. But I do think that as a response to certain crises, I think that makes a lot of sense to me historically.
Yeah, it's also somewhat of a counter to the arrival of people like Sigmund Freud who tell us that we're always mixed up. But the dream is that things can become harmonious if we just wish it or put more effort to it. And that's very unchristian, it's very unbiblical. There's no original sin there. We're not living in this mortal veil of tears. We're now in the kingdom itself, and that's very idolatrous for a Christian. So it's a sort of it's a taming and materialization of Christianity, even though it's all based on the dream of all things.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I hear the phrase the American dream, I for some reason think of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, which is a farce and a great delight, but not a heavyweight lesson like some of those other parts.
Yeah.
It's no bad.
Yeah, no.
So Mike, you're suggesting the American dream is a heresy, essentially. It's a distortion of Christianity.
Yeah, well, a soft one, I suppose, but it's not. It's a religion of success, and that's that. It's based on optimism,
But you can even see it building on the New Testament by distortion, though. Jesus says, I've come that you may have life and have it abundantly to the full, and yet, as you just said, what happens is the full becomes, like in the quote that you just gave us from the 1930s author, it becomes full of prosperity and goods and material wealth and so forth, not spiritual wealth.
Optimism isn't a biblical category. I think those are different things.
Yeah. I mean, Erich Fromm, in his book *The Sane Society* in 1955, he says that one might think that the foremost critics of capitalism in America would be the clergy, because it's an ideology that in many ways is antithetically opposed to some of their core values. And what surprises him is that so many people don't name what we refer to as the American dream as idolatrous. He says this is what in the Hebrew prophets and in Christian tradition that Jesus would call clear kind of blatant idolatry.
From a society that almost destroyed itself in civil war and has remained very divided in many ways since, the unity of the country would appear to be solid and determined, but the history isn't so. So perhaps the American dream is one more effort to keep the show on the road. The ideology of it, the story of it, the image of it, it's a response to pushing this to crises, long run. There's no national unity in the 1930s, so lots of people were very badly treated. So the country doesn't look successful. I'm not a history professor, but I don't think anything here. So.
Opine, by all means.
In addition to your three films you've mentioned, Malik, are there other filmmakers that you think that you would say are doing this sort of spiritual, parabolic the American dream, but just the bigger question of who are we, what's the meaning of human life, and so forth.
Tchaikovsky, Bergman.
Yeah. I mean, some films by Guillermo del Toro, who's a Mexican director, some. And some films by Alejandro Iñárritu, who's another Mexican director, who's won the Oscar for director 2 years in a row.
Okay, some. So pick Iñárritu. So would you say thumbs up to Birdman, thumbs down to Revenant, or the other way around? Or
I think it depends on what one is looking for. Yeah. So I think in Birdman, I think you do get much more explicit attention to critiquing elements of our culture. I mean, it's overt. Our obsession with celebrity, with image, with Twitter popularity, with fandom, with acclamation and adoration from hundreds and thousands of anonymous people we don't know. I think the Revenant's doing something different. But both Iñárritu and Del Toro and even Alfonso Cuarón grow up as Catholics. And there's a certain Catholic sensibility that permeates some of their works. I really like Paul Thomas Anderson, who directed Magnolia, There Will Be Blood, The Master.
You mentioned how hard it is to view Malick films.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, you're picking films that a lot of people would say, those are all very hard to watch for one reason or another.
Sure.
Can anyone, I mean, one of the things that's bracing about Jesus' parables is they're so accessible. Is there any filmmaker who's spinning accessible parables?
That's a great question. What do you think?
It's a nice movie.
Yeah.
Pixar? Would those count?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Up, Inside Out. Yeah, it's very countercultural in certain ways, right? That the critique of the similar kind of insistence on happiness and optimism and joy.
Certainly Scorsese would have something to say on the whole American dream. I mean, in the Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a certain outlier of excess and moral degradation and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Still something about the American dream kind of thing. I know it's in a lot of crime films too. Godfather.
Mm-hmm.
Goodfellas. Casino.
Mm-hmm. How about Field of Dreams?
As an example of a popular?
Yeah, as an accessible, that's interested in substantive issues of meaning and,
M. Night Shyamalan before he went off the rails.
Yeah, sure. Well, and he's very interested in how do we mourn and cope with loss.
Well, he isn't Catholic, but he did go to parochial school as a kid, even though his family is Hindu.
Well, but he was also exposed to a lot of Episcopalian context growing up in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Do you follow TV series?
Some of them, yeah. I love 6 Feet Under.
Okay, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
I think what kind of series tie into that? I mean, all of them kind of do. I mean, there's some common theme going on. People trying to find meaning.
What's fascinating about television is that it's inverted the historically supremacy of film over TV that lasted up until the 1990s. And The Sopranos was the first TV show that the critics thought, oh my goodness, there could be real quality on television. And then that opened the floodgates for. So now you have movie stars. It used to be if you were a TV actor, your whole goal was to get to movies. Because TV was nothing. Now you have people going the other way. And you also have, in terms of character identification, the potential for a much deeper identification when you have hours and hours and hours with certain characters versus just 2 or 3 hours.
I would hear about how Breaking Bad was some kind of satire parable, I'm not sure, or commentary on the American dream.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And in some ways, it's not unlike The Godfather in that regard, or There Will Be Blood.
Any other questions or observations? About out of time. So let's thank Dr. Rindge.